books. So we got 2 stickers. Cool. So welcome everybody. We are going to talk about a pretty big topic over the next 50-ish minutes. We know that we're the ones who stand between you and happy hour, so that's a responsibility we take gravely seriously.
Very seriously.
We'll be quick about it. So basically, we're talking about e-commerce, and broadly defined, that is any application, specifically in this context for the web, where things are bought and sold. Now, even bought and sold is a pretty big concept. We could be talking about physical goods or digital goods. You could be paying for them in like a traditional government-backed currency or a cryptocurrency like Bitcoin. But most of the time when we're talking about e-commerce, we're talking about buying something, be it physical or digital, for money, right, of some kind. So that's a big topic, and all of those implementations, there's a lot of particularities. So what we want to do is give you a sense of what e-commerce implementations have in common with other complex web applications, but also what's particular to them, and furthermore, what's particular to specific ones and specific verticals so that you know how to pick those out as you're planning or scoping or building a project. My name is Drew Messenger-Michaels. This is our Perry. We are in the professional services department at Hybris, right across the street. And we have had the opportunity to see a bunch of e-commerce implementations, and we make e-commerce software at Hybris, and we consult on it. So we've seen, retail, apparel, groceries, aerospace, digital goods, manufacturing, all kinds of stuff. And we have a good sense of what successful projects have in common, and again, how to pick out what makes them different. So first of all, what do e-commerce implementations have in common with other complex websites? Well, they're going to need some kind of application server, some kind of database, and some way of maintaining persistence, some kind of front-end framework. You're going to have to think about mobile strategy, perhaps more so than with other kinds of websites. You'll have to think about search, about navigation, as well as some more under-the-hood concepts that will be of interest here, like caching, like clustering, and of course security and testing are of the utmost importance. So let's dig deeper into some of those concepts.
So first of all, application servers, we see across the board different platforms. Java, obviously, PHP, .NET, they're widely deployed. I would say what we focus on is Java. Seems like most of the really large, complex enterprise systems seem to settle on Java quite a bit. So when you're talking about app servers sitting on top of a Java JVM, obviously the big commercial app server names would be Oracle WebLogic, IBM WebSphere, and JBoss. But we also see a lot of open source, so Apache Tomcat or Jetty. And what I would say here is that with Oracle and with IBM, you will be able to leverage their own proprietary e-commerce platform. However, with the open source, you can take a best-of-breed approach, and I think the real selling point for both the Java stack and Tomcat is there's tons and tons of community knowledge there, very well-defined and well-tried and true tuning and configurations that you can leverage. A huge body of knowledge there. So we see a lot of successful projects going through with that stack.
It's an interesting thing too, because I don't imagine there's a whole lot of resistance in this room to the concept of open source. But when you're on an e-commerce project, you'll notice that the very concept can be political, surprisingly so. There's sometimes, especially with older companies, this idea that open source means you're leaving the house unlocked, right? Or you're leaving the key under the doormat or something. That is not, of course, what it means. But it's an interesting communication challenge to make that clear to the business. Hybris itself is built on the Java stack, specifically the Spring framework, and the Hybris server, the app server that we distribute with, is a distribution of Apache Tomcat. So we know of what we speak when we say that building on open source technologies, A, works, and B, requires some careful communication with business stakeholders who may not be familiar with that kind of ecosystem.
So with database and persistence, you jumped ahead. Obviously, relational databases, a 3-tier architecture is very, very common. And the commercial, or the main players here would be your Oracle, MySQL, and then SQL Server. On top of a relational database, and again, relational as a wide application, another wide body of knowledge and a lot of experience, DBA experience and practices out there on the market. So very typical. And then on top of that, we're usually going to see some kind of object relational mapping when you're getting into the application space. So we're talking Java Persistence API, or Hibernate implements JPAs, of course, and then IDATs. So you're going to have your database layer, your ORM layer. A lot of times, if you're talking about an e-commerce platform, there'll probably be a proprietary ORM layer because managing the data, orders, customers, products, you're going to have an integral part of that platform, and so they may have a proprietary ORM. Hybris is in that space there. Another interesting area that's becoming more and more prevalent is seeing NoSQL. I haven't seen a lot of NoSQL as a general solution for an e-commerce application, but there are a lot of very interesting specific use cases where we're starting to see NoSQL. One use case might be real-time availability or inventory. Mongo has a pretty neat feature where you can do rapid concurrent updates of counters for, say, inventory for a variety of data of distribution centers or stores, where you're constantly feeding information from external sources and keeping those values up to date, and then you can surface that on your website and say this product's available at this location. I've got 20 in stock here or 5 in stock there. There's a couple other applications where you're going to see real-time pricing. Anytime you get into some of these more complex requirements, these different solutions are going to probably make sense. So that's where we're seeing a lot more NoSQL applications. I did it again. All right, so
we never flicker when we rehearse this thing.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Front-end frameworks. Here, you've got a lot of options. MVC Model View Controller, things like struts or Spring MVC, very typical. You have the full stack, what I call frameworks like Ruby on Rails or Grails. And then, of course, Ajax. I've never had a project yet that didn't have some really rich, client implementation with an Angular or jQuery or Dojo. So my message here is you see a wide variety, and most of the commerce platforms will support a variety of front-end frameworks. I think the idea is you should choose a framework that makes sense for your requirements. What kind of user experience are you trying to build? And what is your team's, what is your team experience with, and what have they had success with? So you've got quite a few options here.
Yeah, you can just do double guns. Yeah. So the other thing to think about when you think about front ends, and again, this is true with any complex web application today, but it's especially true when it comes to commerce or anything transactional. You want to think about your mobile strategy, specifically the level of responsiveness. A lot of the early sort of forays into mobile development began with a traditional desktop or full screen experience, and then gradually shrunk themselves down until they were small enough for a phone. That is pretty precisely the wrong way to do it if you want the experience to be a very consistent one for your users. A strategy called mobile first has become a really big trend in design, and I think a good one. The idea is very simple when you state it. It's simply that you should begin by thinking about the smallest number of page elements, the smallest number of pixels, the smallest amount of visual information you're ever going to show when you're designing a website, then build out. One example, and this is not an Hybris example, so there's no self-interest here, would be American Express's website. They actually did some pretty open documentation about how they began with the smallest factor and then built out from a level of responsiveness. That being said, Hybris itself does have some responsive layouts that follow a similar philosophy, which is to say you begin with whatever buttons you think are the most important. Do you need to be able to access your cart at all times? Do you need to be able to access the search bar at all times, etc.? There's all kinds of research about how bounce rates go through the roof if you push a new mobile version of something that does not have whatever unit of navigation people are most used to readily available, be that search or browse or what have you. So this brings me to the concept of responsiveness. This has been a very big buzzword throughout web development lately, but it has a really clear determinative meaning. Responsive front ends are front ends that resize themselves based on the number of pixels being displayed, based on breakpoints, rather than on traditional device detection. I'm looking at an iOS device, so therefore here's my mobile version. Responsive uses a single layout which refactors itself according to what's currently being displayed. I always tell like business users, like, if you don't know if your favorite website is responsive, resize the window, and if the formatting changes, then it's responsive, right? So what's important to understand is that this is not, do I want responsive or do I not want responsive on a project? I have seen many projects blow themselves up completely by saying we need to go completely responsive. We need a responsive website with a capital R, when what really the business stakeholders meant is we need a responsive with a capital R front page. They meant that they wanted an experience that would refactor itself in a very smooth way, but perhaps the rest of the site should take a more traditional adaptive approach. Perhaps transactional pages should. Perhaps there's a mix and match opportunity. The degree to which your website responds and what it responds to is a little bit more of a sliding scale. So this matters from a technology perspective, whether you're using fluid grids or something like that. But more than that, it matters before you write a single line of code from a design perspective. You want to think about which breakpoints you want to use. Additionally, when you think about mobile strategy, you've got to think a little bit about location services. You have the opportunity to do some really interesting things with beacons and so on, especially if you go with a mobile app. As I was walking over here today, I walked by a Verizon store and I got a notification saying, come on in and get a discount on accessories, right? If the user opts in, a mobile application gives you the opportunity to live in their pocket, take advantage of push notifications, again, beacons and things like that, in a way that you simply can't with a mobile website for very good browser security reasons. So mobile strategy is extremely important when you think about e-commerce, specifically because there's, again, study after study that shows, I think we can provide some sources even if you want, that say even people who do not convert on a mobile device tend to shop on a mobile device. I'll begin my shopping experience on my phone, and then especially, we'll talk about persistent carts in a second, if I can pick up that same shopping session on my desktop device or my laptop, I'm going to convert much more often.
On the native app side, we were talking this morning about the scope and cost of building a native app might be incrementally more than just going with a web-only approach. There are some good reasons to go with a native app. I mean, there's a rich amount of features that you can leverage on the phone, whether it's a camera or NFC or location services and things like that you might not be able to leverage as well in a web context.
Absolutely.
But the cost and scope is something you need to consider. What I think we've seen as mitigate that approach is you can do a point application that does maybe a subset of what your website does. So maybe it just has an order form, or maybe it's just a browse site to look at products, whatever. And so if you design your point app well, you have some common services or whatever, a layer there that you can reuse as you incrementally build out different point apps to do different things. Maybe an in-store app that supports your sales personnel in the store, or whatever. You add those incrementally on, and it might mitigate some of the cost and complexity.
You kind of touched on two really good use cases. One would be sort of a point of sale or a kiosk experience. You want to think about that. And the second would be, we mentioned we've worked with some old school B2Bs who maybe initially, at least, did not see the value of a mobile site at all. They thought, well, our customer base is old school. They're not going to mess around with tablets. That seemed kind of...
They're ordering,
right?
Oil and gas pump parts.
Right, they're on a green screen. Yeah. But lo and behold, if I'm in a warehouse and my boss is yelling at me to reorder something and I can do it on my phone, I'm going to do it on my phone. So combining sort of the lessons about design from a B2C, a consumer-facing space, to a B2B space has actually worked out really well for a number of customers that I know that I've personally. So, and I do want to be clear, Art, you make a really good point. I'm not telling you not to make a native app when I say, oh, it's more complex, any more than I'm saying don't go full responsive if that's what's right for the project. Just to think about these as units of functionality that may or may not be right, rather than just chasing the newest thing, right? That's the important thing.
So search and navigation is key. I mean, for a user experience in a commerce context, you need to help your users find the product they want, or on the other hand, what is the product that you're trying to sell? Well, we got to move these, widgets, whatever they are. So this is very key important. On the right-hand side, some very common, or at least Apache Solar, open source, Elasticsearch, I think there was a talk today about. Very powerful platforms for search, navigation, also analytics, which is a different topic we'll talk about. And then Endeca is another Oracle product that's available. So very important part of your user experience. So what does your index schema look like, and what is your data model? You need to know how you're going to model those products in your search engine so that you have what you need to surface on the site. What are the attributes? What are the facets and ranges? Facets is a key navigation component, how users are going to be finding what they're looking for. Filtering, how are you going to filter down that product set that's going to be relevant to your customer and what they need. And personalization of the results at the bottom, I think, ties to filtering as well, for the same reason. What's in that user's profile that makes them, want to key in on a certain set of products? Or what are your merchants and marketers doing that they want to target these products for this user? And again, relevancy and sorting is also key to surfacing just the products that your customers need at the right time. Boost and Bury is a manual kind of way to adjust that natural relevancy and sorting that comes out of the algorithm in the search engine. And then things like type ahead, that's very key in mobile because people aren't going to be wanting to type the entire thing out, and it's got to be predictive, it's got to be giving the right relevant information. Synonyms, obviously, those are words that if a user types one thing, but everything in your catalog or your product set is named something slightly different, or a different word but the same meaning, you need to be able to capture that and get them to the right product. Stop words is a way to filter out noise so that you don't, pollute your search results with, garbage that isn't relevant. And then keyword redirects, where your marketers really want to capture a specific search term and say, here's the product you need to buy.
I would just throw in that if you find yourself in an e-commerce project where the business is very, very highly leveraging keyword redirects, synonyms, and stop words in order to get their base results, you're looking at a project that is not tuned its search engine correctly. Though there are certain degrees of correct results and did you mean functionality and type ahead and so on that should work without you having to be fine-grained like that. So always take a look, that's something that Solar, for example, is very good at. I usually have to get pretty creative with my spelling to stump it if I'm just typing, a keyword that it knows. So always take a look at coarse grain tuning before you get fine grained. That seems like a really simple principle, but I've definitely seen projects where people had gone straight into the really, really specific corner cases without thinking about whether the base search results were correct in the first place.
So index update strategy becomes a real concern. If you have a really large catalog of products, you don't want to spend hours indexing your site so that your customers can see what's out there. And that when you see B2B projects, you're talking extremely large catalogs, lots of hundreds of thousands of products, whatever. So how you tune your process from the export of data out of your database into the index and making that happen becomes critical for performance and just overall operational needs. And finally, the last topic, and we'll talk more about this later, but internationalization when in the context of search and navigation is very key as well. I mean, some of it has to do with how you, again, design your data model and what does your search platform support. But multi-language, you have to have a separate index for each language. How do you organize that? How is it going to handle prices for a given site that's going to be in dollars versus Canadian dollars versus euros? These are all things that you need to think about and organize your search index so it can efficiently provide that information in a performant way.
Yep. Shall I advance or do you want to?
You advance.
I'll
I think
advance.
you're doing
All right,
good.
I got it. I'm on it.
All right. So the next two topics are clustering and caching. So we'll talk first about clustering. Why are we doing this? Obviously, we need failover. You will have a site that has operational needs. Something bad could happen when one of your nodes goes down. You want to be able to move customers over to a working node, or else you're going to lose sales. High availability is related to that. And finally, scalability. You need to be able to provide your website to your customers on Black Friday, Cyber Monday. So you need that scalability to be able to support high amounts of traffic. The more traffic you get, the more you sell, the more money you make.
My favorite thing you ever said, we won't name names obviously, but you said, I just got a call from a customer and they said, man, we're experiencing a traffic spike, and it was Cyber Monday. So they hadn't planned ahead at all for that being a thing, right? They were excited that they were getting traffic, but they were in no way infrastructurally prepared. So,
yeah. So if you click, we have concerns here though, because once you get into a clustered environment in any application context, you got to start thinking about session handling. Session replication, or do I go sticky session? Session replication has a lot of benefits as far as if one node goes down, you can reroute that user to another node through your load balancer. They don't lose any data. Their session is still there. Their cart is still there. They've got all the things they were ready to buy and so on and so forth. However, it adds another layer of complexity to your application, which is you've got to have some kind of network aware communication between nodes to make sure that that data gets replicated to each node. And that can get pretty non-performant and hard to manage pretty quickly. Sticky session, we find, works pretty well. I mean, as long as you persist the data you need in the persistent data store, the relational database, or wherever you're doing it, you can usually do pretty well with just a sticky session. So if that node goes down, they get redirected. Yeah, their session might need to be rebuilt, but their persisted cart data is still there. They pick up and they go on. And it does mitigate a lot of the network traffic and management that you need to deal with when you're talking about session replication. Session replication, Tomcat does support it, but there's quite a bit of configuration involved, or you can go with the coherence or some other component that's going to provide that for your application. The other thing is,
sorry, that was my bad.
No,
I think I hit the switch screens button, which is my mistake. Sorry about that.
So, cache invalidation, and we'll talk about caching on the next slide, but once you start putting data in your application in memory, how are you going to make that sync across different nodes in a cluster? So that's something you need to think about. How does that work? Do you replicate the whole cache, or do you just do cache invalidation so that any given node needs to update certain pieces of data when the time is needed? And finally, network latency. If your network is slow, then all of these things get very wonky and hard to manage. And that's something, sort of a low-level thing you need to ensure in your data center, that you have adequate resources to provide a robust cluster. All right. With caching, basically we see different strategies for different data in your application. So application data, in a commerce application, we're talking carts, we're talking orders, we're talking customers, we're talking products, and all the related stuff that you're living inside your application. We do this because you don't want to have to make a full round trip to the relational database across the network every request or every piece of data. So we set up some kind of caching solution. cache is something we use in Hybris. It's an open source component that's very nice and plugs right in very well. Now we don't replicate the actual cache data across the network, across nodes in the cluster, because that becomes very non-performant very quickly as you scale. But we do just send invalidation messages across. You have multicast, that's a pretty efficient process. You don't have to do point-to-point communication to keep that the same. Then we get into, so in a higher layer, you're talking about web content and page fragments. How are you going to, if you have a component on your site that's a carousel or a form for collecting address data, whatever, those are things that you can just piece together, put them in a page fragment cache, much more efficient than having to re-render that to the on the server side all the way to the client every request or every time it comes up. And then edge caching, the content delivery network like an Akamai or some other solution that's going to take certainly static content, so media, JavaScripts and style sheets, all that stuff. Just don't even let it come to your origin, to your app server, because it's just going to burn cycles doing something that could just be stupid and just be sent out immediately. But configuring and tuning that is a key piece that a lot of projects don't do quite well enough and have to tweak to make everything perform once you get into production. Security is something I can't stress enough. This has got to be front of mind for any application. Obviously, you need to have your network DMZs and firewalls set up correctly, configured, make sure that they're secure and can't be penetrated with any other traffic other than what you intend. You need to do penetration testing to validate this. That has to be part of every project. Every web project has to do this nowadays. Something like a cross-site scripting filter, you need to make sure that's in place and that it's configured to capture the right script patterns that are going to be a problem in attacks on your site. Setting up a web application firewall, that would include the CSS filter and some of the other features that you need to ensure that you're not vulnerable. And I'll mention the OWASP top 10 if you're not familiar with it. That's the Open Web Application Security Project. So I should provide a link to that. But it's really nice, quick hit of the top issues that you need to look out for. Script injection or SQL injection was number 1. Number 2, broken authentication and session management. Number 3 is cross-site scripting, I mentioned. Number 4 is insecure direct object references, so how you're referencing objects in your application layer. 5 is security misconfiguration. You need to look at all those configurations on the different layers, make sure that there's nothing quite missing or misconfigured. 6 is sensitive data exposure. Obviously, you need to make sure that sensitive data is masked or not available or accessible in the wrong context. 7 is missing function level access control, so ACLs, making sure that the different functions that you expose in your application have the proper security attached to them and that that's validated on every request. Number 8 is cross-site request forgery. 9 would be using components with known vulnerabilities. You need to make sure that your Apache server is patched, that your Tomcat's patched, that your whatever version of a load balancer you're using, all these things are patched at the proper level. SSL, no more heartbleed. We need to make sure we get that upgraded. And finally, the last one is number 10, unvalidated redirects and forward. So all those things need to be checked. Now, there are tools out there, and there are services that you can hire in to do this penetration testing for you, and it makes life really easy because they'll just you give them your URL, say go to town, boom, they'll just give you a report. 1, 2, 3, you got to remediate this, this, and this. Very key though, otherwise you're going to be very sorry. And the cost of dealing with flaws in your security model is going to be so much higher than the cost of making that spend during the project when you're doing it.
Absolutely, and I'd add that some of the biggest security kerfuffles, so to speak, that I've ever seen didn't necessarily even have to do with any particular one of these things. They just had to do with, again, lack of communication or what might be called common sense. I've seen live websites with the default admin credentials still enabled. Or they've created some super admin group during development so that the power user who's going to have to administrate the team on the customer side could test things end to end. They left that enabled. Just leaving certain doors open that need to be closed, not checking, not making sure that you're aware of the full data set and who has access to what, can be as dangerous as a more technical problem. So.
And then we get to testing again. And so I repeat myself a little bit here, but regression testing, some thoughts?
Yeah, so regression testing, so obviously, again, with any complex web application with a lot of moving parts, we talked about keeping your app server and everything else up to date. You're going to need to make sure that old features that you've built or that come from other services or other applications or other technologies still work. This is, of course, doubly and triply important with e-commerce because there are even more moving parts. And again, when you get into transactionality, we'll talk about PCI compliance in a little bit, right? It's extremely important that you test every time you upgrade one of these important parts. So this ties very closely into continuous development. You're kind of never done. I've seen a lot of improperly run projects where phase 2 becomes code for, yes, we're never going to do that. But in a properly run project, phase 2 is a real thing, phase 3, 4, 5. You want to keep developing. You want to make sure that you're taking advantage of the best of breed technology, right? There's really no point in doing these things we've been talking about where you're basing your technology on an open source stack, taking advantage of best of breed and community involvement and knowledge and all that, if you're not doing continuous regression testing and continuous development to make sure that you're using all of the best of breed stuff together effectively. The best of breed not talking to each other doesn't do you much good. So regression testing and continuous development, very important.
So performance testing, again, another thing I would stress, just like security, you cannot leave this out of your project, even though many projects do. And this includes load testing, so just throwing a lot of traffic at your site. Peak testing, so this is what you expect to see on Black Friday or Cyber Monday. You need to ramp it up to that level. You can't fall short and say, I think we'll be fine.
I've seen prayer used as a substitute.
I didn't put prayer on the list for a reason.
Yeah.
And soap testing, so this is where you're running your application for hours, maybe even days, because there's always going to be issues that are only going to crop up after a long time of heavy traffic. We finally fill up that heap or whatever. So these are things that you need to build into your project. A couple things I'll mention that are good resources for this. There are some testing tools. JMeter is very common. But there are also some services you can use, like SOSTA. We've had some projects have a lot of success. They're like you hire them in, they set up a test bed that's out on Amazon Cloud, and so they can basically spin up traffic from different geographical areas, different types of network regions or whatever. They work with you to build out the test scripts and the requirements. So it's really nice to do. And then on the other side of that, you need some kind of performance monitoring. So there are commercial APM tools like Dynatrace, New Relic, or AppDynamics. Or if you're getting into that, you'll probably be a little better off than if you're just doing like Visual VM on each JVM, because that can be very difficult to manage all that data and see what your system is actually doing under load.
Okay, so those are again all things that are particularly important in e-commerce, but that are at least present in other complicated web applications. What makes e-commerce e-commerce, and how in each of these areas do you listen for the important parts of a given project? How do you focus your energy and your attention and your time on what's most valuable for a given implementation? So what do we need? We need cart, we need checkout, we need customer account management, some kind of pricing and promotional logic. There's got to be some kind of payment gateway. Once payment occurs, there needs to be fulfillment, warehouse management. We need to think about our strategy for personalization, internationalization, and business intelligence, as well as integration with whatever the source of truth is, if what you're currently working with is not the source of truth. So let's talk about each of these in a bit more detail. First of all, carts. So carts are one of the things that change the most depending on vertical, depending on what kind of implementation you're doing. In a B2C retail space, the concern around carts is very much about merging carts, right? If I start shopping on my phone, like we were talking about earlier, and I log back in on a desktop site, do I have both what I was looking at before and what I have since I started browsing again? Very important. In a B2B setting, they're much more concerned about things like shared carts. Can I collaborate on a cart? Can I build an order together? Does that maybe tie into wish list functionality, or something closer to a gift registry, or something closer to a saved order? That logic is something we need to think about a lot. Do we want customers to be able to save multiple carts? Do we want different delivery options? Again, this changes pretty radically based on vertical. One of the things that can be an interesting exercise is to kind of hot rod a system built for shipping physical goods to ship digital goods, right? There are more and more systems that take digital goods into account as a kind of fulfillment, but there are also a lot that you sort of have to just short circuit the step where it sends something or convince it that it already did. There's a lot of thinking to be done around that. There we go. Like I said, pricing, right? So if you're going to sell things, you have to sell them for a price. Pretty straightforward, right? Again, though, this logic can change quite a bit. Generally, in a B2C setting, what you're dealing with most of the time is a regular price and some sale price or several sale prices, which then need to be chosen from or prioritized. These are maybe divvied up by customer segments, they're time-sensitive, things like that. There again, though, are interesting use cases here. Again, working with B2Bs a lot, manufacturers and stuff, I've encountered a lot of situations where they're not actually interested in marking down from the regular or list price, they're interested in marking up. The list price is actually what they pay. It's their cost in some sense. And for suppliers, they need to show various lists, and they need to, more to the point, not show various lists. So attaching logic to prices, promotions, etc. becomes very important. Again, customer-specific pricing is absolutely key. Having lists of prices attached to a certain customer group or a certain region can really make the experience actually work in the way it's supposed to, as well as complex promotion rules. What kind of stacking do you want? Again, what kind of stacking don't you want? This has changed a lot in the last couple of years. If you're thinking about vouchers, as we call them in Hypress, or coupons, as they're sometimes more commonly known, a while ago there was a really interesting study I read that said if someone gets to the checkout page of a website, an e-commerce site, that they're on for the first time, and they see a coupon code field, and they don't have a coupon code, what was it, like 32% of the time they just leave, because they feel like they couldn't possibly be getting the best deal, right? What happens now is there are sites like Retail Me Not and stuff like that where all active coupons are archived for you, right? That's both good and bad. It makes it sort of harder to do a private or targeted promotion without introducing some actual systemic logic around segmentation. But it also means that you can use that as an opportunity to advertise to people, to reward them for looking into what other offers you have, and direct them toward other things they may be interested in. You can use sort of the interconnectedness of that experience to your advantage. Payment gateways. So we've agreed on a price. We know what promotions we qualify for. We've entered a coupon if there is one. Now we need to pay, right? Generally speaking, a third-party service will take care of this, again, for PCI compliance reasons, among other things. And your payment gateway or some other third-party service will take care of tax calculation, address verification, fraud detection. Now, the payment gateway I have worked most often with is CyberSource. There are, of course, a lot of other ones. There's WorldPay if you want to get into other parts of the world. There is stuff like Alipay, which is sort of an escrow service for individual purchases, really big in China and other places. But that's not all payment gateways do. Like I said, there also is address verification or validation, and there's also fraud detection, and these payment gateways tend to charge by transaction, regardless of what it is they're doing. So if your payment gateway says, okay, this is a fraudulent order, this is a stolen credit card, or it's on a blacklist or something like that, you still get charged for the privilege of finding that out. Therefore, it makes sense to have some of these services handled elsewhere. Having a second or a coarse-grained layer, a first line of defense as regards fraud detection at your application layer for your e-commerce site begins to make sense. So have some kind of check against a whitelist or blacklist of domains, maybe have an order value that trips a different workflow that sends that order to a different team to make sure that it's legitimate, and so on.
So with payment gateways, obviously you get into an area of PCI compliance. So the PCI is payment card industry, I think.
I
Something.
that, yeah.
Anyway, it's
so many acronyms that okay.
The PCI DSS, which is the data security standards, is a market-wide standard of tools and expectations on how you're going to secure anything payment related. And the purpose of this slide is not to read through it, but just see, these are just some examples of what can go wrong if you don't do this right. So the bottom line is, when you think about the per transaction cost of using a payment gateway, again, the best way to be PCI compliant is to not store any payment data on your servers, on your environment at all, and push that off to a payment gateway. You're better off that way. Even though there's a cost involved, it's going to save you money when you don't have to worry about something like this. And these are some big names in the world.
Yeah, and they felt the pain. By the way, you were exactly right. Payment card industry. PCI DSS is payment card industry data security standard. So that's what we're dealing with here. All right.
So with fulfillment and warehouse management, this is a really key area from an operational perspective because it's very process-centric. I mean, don't get me wrong, this is part of your customer experience, okay? Not just on your website, but what is it all the way through to when they get their product delivered, whatever. It's very key. So it's process-centric, so you'll usually see a lot of BPM, business process management platforms being used. Either they're included in your commerce platform or you can attach one on as an integration. That tool needs to be flexible enough to support your current process, however it may be, or future processes. As you expand your business, you expand regions, you add different distribution centers, whatever. You need to be able to adapt that process. Things like inventory in real time. I talked about some technical solutions using, NoSQL or whatever. But this is stuff that you need to actually work into your process layer as well, so that you can manage that across your whole, your fulfillment process. And obviously, sourcing logic. You might want to be able to source from retail stores. You might want to have your warehouses in different regions, locations, whatever. There's some complexity that goes into making that happen. And you can leverage that to really have an on-demand kind of real-time, just-in-time sourcing process. Or if you do it wrong, you can destroy your customer experience.
Yeah, and business process and business logic can really be the sticking point here. As with promotions, by the way, right? The technology is there in our stuff in Hybris and elsewhere to, for example, source a piece of inventory based on geography, right? Make sure it's shipping from the closest place to save on fuel. Or, well, we have 100 in this warehouse and only 10 in this one, so source from the one with more. The technology is there. The logic is not actually that complicated, but is the business process aligned with that, or could it be? That's actually the number one question to ask, right? Again, we've seen people go down the rabbit hole of trying to implement some really good intelligent shipping features that the business actually couldn't support. So if there's bad data coming in, you're not going to get a good result. Speaking of data, right? So personalization is a very, very important element of any e-commerce site these days. If you want to personalize web content, restrict the product selection, we talked about this a little bit earlier, right? Divvying stuff up by customer groups. The same way you can do that with prices, you can do it with the availability of products in the first place. Besides the obvious stuff of just giving a different selection or a special selection or a curated selection to certain groups of customers, this is all that's really involved in creating experiences that sometimes get sold as standalone packages, like microsites, like private shopping. That's really just as simple as restricting a certain set of content, product or page related, to a certain set of customers. Internationalization. So, do you want to have multiple currencies? Do you want to have multiple languages? Do you want to have multiple sites? And if yes to any of these, what is the relationship among them? I've seen people approach projects as though this is all one-to-one-to-one. If we have a country, that's a site. If we have a country, that's a site. If we have a country, that's a site, and so on. I've also seen people say, well, it should all just be one thing, and it's not really a project, right? The truth is somewhere in between. You can have a unified experience. It's pretty common these days to have a website that speaks multiple languages and or sells in multiple currencies, but the relationship between them takes work and thinking, but isn't always totally intuitive. Classic example is most Canadian retailers, for example, want to have one currency but two languages, right? They want to have Canadian dollars and they want to sell in English and French. So to architect that, you have to think a little bit about how you define regions. Because if you're selling in Canadian dollars and English and French, you still need to internationalize the currency display so the dollar sign shows up after and there's commas versus decimals and things like that. Business intelligence sort of takes personalization to the next level, right? In addition to automating product recommendations or things like that, perhaps you just want to collect reports. We'll talk about how exactly you do that in one sec. But if you want to take a look at web traffic, conversion rates, what are your best-selling products, what are your most abandoned products, that can be really important for figuring out profitability.
So ERP integration, we touched on this before, but you'll always very often run into this as the source of truth for whatever data. It's going to be product, pricing, customer. I mean, you have varying levels of complexity. But this is your back-end system or systems. I mean, many of the larger organizations, if they're kind of a multinational or an enterprise that's been built through acquisitions and mergers, they're going to have multiple back-end systems that will probably never be completely merged and migrated together. We see this all the time. So you're going to need an integration pattern that's going to work for potentially very disparate group of functions or systems that you need to interact with. And the source of truth is key because you need to make sure that integrity is maintained across all these systems. So ESB, Enterprise Service Bus, I see a lot of successful projects that have this in place. If an enterprise has made the investment to put that in place, you're usually sitting in a good position if they did it right. They've got some kind of ESB, so if they need to add, if they buy another subsidiary, they just plug the system into that ESB, it'll flow right through and the data will come right out on your website. You can do it wrong and make yourself some pain, but that's a great sort of integration pattern to use.
Yep.
Often though, what I see a lot of is, no, we didn't invest in an ESB or we couldn't get it off the ground or only some of the systems really are doing that, so we have to do a remote function call, point-to-point integration. You see a lot of it. You have to, hopefully design your application layers in a way that you can isolate and sort of swap out these things as they change, because these systems are always going to have different, deployment patterns, different build schedules, rollouts, and all kinds of things. So you need to manage all this. And then you get into the more batch import-export, which again is very common, especially with the big iron, mainframe ERP systems that we see quite a bit of.
Yep. So you've got to take that into account, that you may not have access to the system of record or the source of truth when people are thinking about all the shiny functionality we've been discussing, right? Which obviously, to a lot of you, this stuff is very high level, right? This is just kind of, a tasting menu of options, tips and tricks, things like that. But the two most important things to remember that a lot of people don't remember is, number one, you may not have control of the data that is the source of truth. And number two, you will probably not be running the site, will probably not be responsible for the care and feeding once the project is live. So the last but not least thing I do want to mention is back office tooling. Somebody who has way less knowledge of how this all works than you will probably be running this thing down the road. And the first kind you want to think about is content management. Products, pages, metadata, SEO, digital assets. Are those digital assets stored in a content delivery network? Are they managed in a digital asset management tool? Or do they all live centrally in your web application file system? You also need to think about customer service, both for order placement and impersonation. Do you want to have a nice handy tool for your CSRs, your customer CSRs, the project CSRs, to help customers check out or to find products? If so, should they have special options as far as troubleshooting and appeasement? Should they be able to offer free gift products that customers can't see? Price overrides, special offers. For some projects I've seen, the answer to all of these is emphatically yes. And for some, the answer is emphatically no. Definitely don't give them that option. Very often, they're somewhere in between. It ties into that security and permission stuff we were talking about earlier, where some people have greater ability to override that stuff than others. You also want to think about data import and export. The two big kinds being synchronous, as in stock checking and price calls, if this isn't the system of record for that, social media or native app integration, as well as asynchronous data integration, CSV or XLS export, scheduled tasks, backups, that kind of thing. Finally, last but not least, among the last, I didn't put the 4 out of 4, so you know we're getting close, because I know it's not a lot. So, analytics and reporting. This covers both operational reports, which generally you're thinking of the performance or metrics or audit trails for employees internally, and transactional reports where you're thinking of what's been sold, again, what's been abandoned the most, and so on. So, what we're saying is that the goal with an e-commerce implementation, perhaps more than other kinds of implementations, is to be future-proof. That seems pretty obvious, right? You always want what you're building to work down the line, but it actually is a somewhat different way of thinking about development. Being future-proof doesn't mean you have a crystal ball. Nobody knows what any given vertical is going to look like in 5 or certainly 10 years, and anyone who tells you they do know that should be looked at suspiciously, right? What it means is you want to make decisions based on the technology available that makes sense for where you want to be down the line, not just where you are today.
And I think key, too, is time to market is very short, we see in e-commerce projects. If you can't get that website up and running quickly, your business, you're losing money. You can't sell because it's not there.
That's the thing. The return on investment with e-commerce is really simple. If you have a good experience and your website runs well, then you're going to make a lot of money. So you want to start creating those conversions. You want to start adding in that transactionality as quickly as possible. But if we've driven anything home today, and I hope we have, it's that means looking at this full range of features and figuring out what the full range of necessary features is. Or in other words, you can't afford to underinvest in your e-commerce implementation. You want to think upfront about what it is you want to build, and from the beginning, even if you launch with a relatively small subset of those features, you want to know what you're aiming toward. It's absolutely vital in this space. We got 5 minutes?
We're actually done.
Cool.
I thought we had 5 minutes for questions.
I thought we had to wrap at 4:20, and that was like perfect time.
Okay, I can't believe